Hello and welcome. Let's discuss maximum permissible bank finance method or the MPBF method. This method is also called Tandon Committee Recommendations. The Tandon Committee recommends a very conservative approach in the finance of working capital requirement of the borrowers. The core recommendations are that the assessment of the working capital requirement should be linked to the level of operations and the kind of industry. The borrower should bring in a minimum level of margin. Here the committee recommends minimum contribution from the borrower. And the residual portion should be financed by the bank. The Tandon Committee aims to discipline the borrower in respect of the working capital management. The committee recommends industry-wise standard holding norms for inventory of raw material, work in progress and finished goods, and also the receivables. For example, the bank fund should not be used to stock up in excess of normal requirement as per the industry standards. Moreover, the bank fund should not be used to indulge in speculative trading of inventories. Any excess level of inventories should be brought down in tune with the industry standards. The MPBF method appraises the working capital requirement based on the projected working capital gap of the borrower. The working capital gap means the current assets minus current liabilities other than the bank borrowings. The working capital requirement is financed by various entities in the business. The funding of the working capital is supposed to be primarily financed by the borrower. Then the working capital requirement is assisted by the sundry creditors. Next, the trade credit provided by the trade suppliers is a major source of finance. Finally, the residual portion of the working capital is financed by the bank. Therefore, the primary contribution should first come from the owners, then from the sundry creditors, and then from the trade suppliers in order of priority. Banks occupy a secondary role in financing the working capital requirement of the borrower in the form of cash credit or overdraft. Okay? The Tandon Committee recommends 3 methods to assess the maximum permissible bank finance based on the projected sales by the borrower. Here also the banks justify the projected sales whether they are achievable. Now let's have a look at the 3 methods one by one. The first method suggests that of the working capital gap, 25% of the working capital gap should be financed by the borrower. That means that the minimum margin of the borrower is 25% of the working capital gap. The maximum finance by the bank should be 75% of the working capital gap in the form of cash credit. This would give a current ratio of 1.18:1. In actual practice, banks finance lower of the MPBF and the difference of the working capital gap and the net working capital as a matter of caution. The second method suggests that the borrower's margin should be 25% of the current assets. The maximum finance to be provided by the bank should be the balance arrived at after deducting the working capital gap with the borrower's margin in the form of cash credit. This method gives a current ratio of 1.33:1. Here again, the banks actually finance lower of the MPBF so arrived and the difference of the working capital gap and the net working capital as a matter of caution. The third method is very conservative. The Tandon Committee has suggested segregating the current assets into core current assets and non-core current assets. Here the borrower's margin is very stiff. The core current assets should be entirely funded by the borrower. Additionally, the borrower has to fund 25% of the non-core current assets as margin. The maximum finance provided by the bank would be the balance arrived at after deducting the working capital gap with the borrower's margin in the form of cash credit. This method gives a current ratio of 1.67:1. The third method has not been considered by the Reserve Bank of India. Therefore, the third method is not in practice in banks. Only the first method and the second method is applicable in banks. Now, let's take up a case study to understand the MPBF concepts. We will straight away go to our Excel sheet. In this case study, you will find that the audited figures have been provided for 2 years and the borrower has also provided the projected figures for the next year. Here the gross sales, the current assets, the current liabilities and short-term bank borrowings in the form of cash credit have been given. At the same time, the bank has also identified the core current assets to assess the MPBF under the third method. We will work out the blank cells one by one. Okay? Now let's have a look at the MPBF methods. For clarity, the format has been readied for each method. That is the first method, the second method, and the third method. Okay? Now let's get to work. At first, we will prepare the data required for computation of the MPBF. Okay? Fine. So the audited gross sales have been provided for the last year and the current year, and also the projected gross sales have been provided. So let's find out the percentage growth in sales, right? So the percentage growth in sales would be 220 minus 200 divided by 200 into 100. That gives a 10% growth from last year till the current year. So what is the percentage growth for the projected year? We'll find it out. It's 242 minus 220 divided by 220 into 100, right? It gives a 10% growth here also. So here we need to analyze the sales and justify the projected sales, right? Now it comes to 10% in both the years. That is 10% in the current year and 10% in the projected year. So we will accept the projected sales, right? So the accepted level of sales would be 242, right? Okay. Let's now work out the working capital gap. So what is the formula for the working capital gap? It is current assets minus current liabilities minus the short-term bank borrowings, right? So we will find out the current liabilities other than the bank borrowings. So it is current liabilities minus short-term bank borrowings. It comes to 7.57. So we will work it out for current year and the projected year. Fine. So now let's work out the working capital gap. So the working capital gap would be current assets minus current liabilities other than the bank borrowings. So it is 58.42 minus 7.57. Good. So we will work it out for the next 2 years. Good. Now let's find out the net working capital. What is the formula? Current assets minus current liabilities. So it is 58.42 minus the current liabilities of 32.57. So we'll work it out for the next 2 years. Good. Now let's find out the non-core current asset. Now the current assets are segregated into core current assets and non-core current assets. So what is the non-core current asset? It is current assets minus core current assets. Okay. So it is 43.42. We will work it out for the next 2 years. Good. So our data is complete. Now let's go to each method. Now the first method stipulates that the MPBF would be working capital gap less the borrower's margin. And the borrower's margin would be 25% of the working capital gap. So what is the working capital gap here? The working capital gap we have already found out. 50.85. We'll work it out for the next 2 years. Good. Now let's find out the borrower's margin here. The borrower's margin would be 50.85 into 25%. Okay. So it comes to 12.71. Fine. Now let's find out the MPBF under the first method. It would be working capital gap minus the borrower's margin. So the MPBF under the first method would be 38.14 for last year, 47.42 in the current year, and 48.56 in the projected year. Fine. Now, would the banks finance the whole of the MPBF? No. The bankers are very conservative. The Tandon Committee recommends the maximum level of finance. The banks in actual practice finance the MPBF or the difference between the working capital gap and the net working capital, right? Why? Because the bank ensures that the existing margin in the working capital should not be diluted. So let's find out the actual finance. The actual finance would be the MPBF designated as A and the difference of working capital gap and the net working capital designated as B. So let's find out the working capital gap less the NWC, right? So it is working capital gap minus NWC, right? So it comes to 25 for last year, and so we will work it out for the next 2 years. So the actual finance would be the lower of MPBF and the working capital gap less the net working capital. So B is lower, and here also it is 32, that is B is lower, and in the projected year also 48.56 is higher than 32. Actual finance would be 32, right? Good. Now let's go to the second method. In the second method, the borrower's margin is 25% of the current assets, right? So let's find out the working capital gap. It's 50.85. We'll work it out for the next 2 years. So the borrower's margin would be 25% of the current assets and not 25% of the working capital gap as in the first method. So what is the borrower's margin? It would be 25% of the current assets. So 25% of the current assets, right? Good. So we'll work it out for the next 2 years. So the borrower's margin is 25% of the current assets. MPBF would be the working capital gap less the borrower's margin. Okay. So you have your MPBF. We'll work it out for the next 2 years. Now, the actual finance would be A or B, whichever is lower. So it would be the MPBF or the difference of WCG minus NWC. Okay. So we'll find out the working capital gap less the NWC, working capital gap less NWC. So it is 25. So the actual finance would be the lower of A or B. In this case, it is for the last year, it is 25. For next year, it is also B, 32. And in the projected year, it is 32, right? Now let's go to the third method. The stipulation of the borrower's margin is most stringent here. Under the third method, the bank segregates the current assets into core current assets and non-core current assets. The entire core current assets is contributed by the borrower as his margin. In addition, the borrower has to contribute 25% of non-core current assets as his additional margin. So what is the borrower's margin? It is the core current assets plus 25% of non-core current assets into 25%. It comes to 25.86. So it is core current assets plus 25% of non-core current assets. We'll work it out for the next 2 years. And now let's find out the working capital gap. The working capital gap has already been calculated. Fine. Now let's find out the MPBF. The MPBF would be the working capital gap less the borrower's margin. The MPBF for the next 2 years has also been calculated. Now here also the same thing, the actual finance would be the lower of A or B. So the working capital gap minus NWC would be 50.85 minus 25.85, right? So we'll work it out for the next 2 years. Now let's find out the actual finance, A or B, whichever is lower. For the last year, both are same. So the actual finance would be 25. In the current year, the MPBF is lower than B. The actual finance would be the MPBF. And here in the projected year, the MPBF is lower, right? So the actual finance would be the MPBF. Now, what do you see under the three methods? First, the borrower's margin in the first method is the lowest, right? Followed by the second method, right? Here we'll find that the borrower's margin is more than the borrower's margin under the first method, right? And the borrower's margin under the third method is the highest, the most stringent. Secondly, the MPBF method worked out under the first method is the most liberal, followed by the second method, and the MPBF under the third method is the most stringent, right? First method and the second method are applicable in banks, but the third method has not been accepted by the Reserve Bank and they are not in use. Okay.